Delighted to be here with everyone, and we'll kick this right off. Um, the context for today's discovery dialogue is the what I'm referring to as the summer from hell, which was the case in many parts of the world, but certainly the case in North America, where climate change has kind of become unmistakable and undeniable, even to the deniers. And so this month, we're going to tackle climate when Capital Institute's focus is normally the economy, and we think of climate change as a symptom of the dysfunctional political economy that we have. And I'm just really honored to have two of my heroes, Gus Speth and Bill McKibben, to be here with us, and really use this space as a moment to just pause a bit and reflect, as opposed to being on the front lines of the battle. And I know, for speaking for myself, it's become it's become difficult to even talk about this with friends and family. I was doing, in sort of preparing for this, I was going back, and maybe I'll start with you, Gus. Gus has been on this case for over 50 years, and there's a video on his website where he's in 1981 speaking, and this was after he had worked in the Carter administration. He was speaking to in a documentary, and the video ends by him saying, "The pressures pushing against a response are great." And then his final sentence, "I think it's going to be terribly difficult." And that was in 1981. And his career, if you Google Gus, if you don't know Gus, his career is really extraordinary. But what I want to highlight is that it was in the late 1960s that he first set up the Natural Resource Defense Council, and then the Carter administration. And he'll, I hope, share an anecdote. He actually introduced the issue of climate change to the Carter administration, and went on to found the World Resource Defense Council, and then ran the UNDP, the largest chunk of the United Nations, before he went on to run Yale's School of Environment. And it's just extraordinary what he has accomplished. And I've had the good fortune to know Gus over the last, I don't know, it's got to be 15 years or so. And he's also, on top of all of his resume stuff, he's just a wonderfully warm human being. And so, Gus, thanks for joining us, and thanks for all your work. And to introduce Bill McKibben is kind of silly. I went and counted the books. I think he's written 20 books. Is that about right, Bill?
Yeah, more or less.
More or less. The latest one is sort of a memoir. I highly recommend it. It essentially, where did we go wrong in America? And I discovered then that Bill grew up in a suburb similar to me. We were born in the same year, but we had a very different experience. And so it was fun to get to know you, Bill, through the book. I was thinking we would play Kumbaya here instead of Leonard Cohen, but we stuck with Leonard Cohen. But Bill's commitment to these issues is, kind of hard to describe. And what comes to my mind is the personal sacrifice. The guy has just been relentless, giving speeches, writing books, writing papers, just endlessly. And both Gus and Bill spent a little time in jail together, which is kind of fun. Maybe we'll ask them to talk about that. But the first thing I wanted to do really is just to ask each of you to share with us, there's the book, thanks, The Flag, the Cross, and the Station Wagon. But maybe Gus, starting with you, you're now an elder of the climate movement, like it or not, and we're all struggling to figure out how to process what's actually happening. I would just love to hear your wisdom on how how we should be thinking about it all at this moment.
Well, I don't know too much about wisdom, but it's great to be on the program with you two youngsters. And there are a lot of people here with us, and that's wonderful. Thank you all for tuning in. I was approached by a scientist and an advocate for environment way back in 1979, and I took this issue to President Carter that year, 1979, when they succeeded in producing a report for me that I felt was good enough to waltz into the White House, which I did. And this issue's been a preoccupation, as John mentioned, ever since. I try not to answer, John's question. I try not to obsess about it or think about the failure of my own advocacy too much. It would be depressing, I think, because the result is certainly tremendously upsetting. So instead, what I've tried to do is to stay in the fight, despite my advancing age. And in a way, John, that's been my salvation, to stay in the fight and to do what I can do at every point. And I don't know how much the story about going to jail with this guy, McKibben, who I knew really well already, so he felt comfortable asking me to join him in a march in D.C. against the Keystone XL pipeline, and I did, and I I ended up in jail as a cellmate with Bill for 3 days. We had adjoining cells, and it was quite an experience. But I have to give Bill a real credit for the fact that I now have a record and a jailbird status. I really thank you, Bill. And actually, I get a lot of dinners, meal tickets out of telling the story of our arrest and giving a lecture in the central cell block of the D.C. jail.
Bill,
how are you feeling these days?
Well, I'm feeling, but let me just extend that story a little bit from jail, because there was an interesting one. We weren't expecting, really. They don't usually put peaceful protesters in central cell block in DC for a few days, but they were trying to deter us from continuing these protests. So there we were, and it was as much fun as it sounds like. But Gus, if I'm remembering correctly, your son was attorney at a White Shoe law firm or something there in DC. And so they weren't letting any of us talk to lawyers or things, but I think he was papering the jailhouse with writs of one kind or another and demanding access to his dad. So we heard that they were going to pull him out to speak to his son for a minute. And this was going to be our one chance to kind of get a message out to the press and things. And so Gus and I were conspiring about what he should say, what sentence he should hand over. And truthfully, it was one of the more important things that anyone, I think, ever said in the course of these environmental fights. Because Gus had done, as you said in your introduction, every right thing that everyone is supposed to do, worked for the president, founded a huge organization, ran development at the UN, been a dean at Yale, for heaven's sakes, on and on and on, all that you could ask in the kind of correct and establishment ways about going about trying to change things. And here he was. So the one sentence statement he put out, correct me if I'm wrong, Gus, just said, I've held a lot of important positions in this town. Yeah. None of them seem as important as the one I'm in right now. And I think actually that may have been true in a sense, because beating Keystone was one of the few major setbacks we've managed to inflict on the most dangerous industry on the planet. But there haven't been enough of those, and this summer was the proof. We saw the highest temperatures we've ever seen. When I say we, I mean anyone who vaguely resembles a human being, because it was hotter in June and July than it's been for at least 125,000 years on this planet. That astonishing heat is continuing. September is going to be the most anomalous month we've ever recorded, the highest above normal, because this El Nino is compounding on top of the extraordinary global warming we've kicked off. And, the result is that we're losing the most basic physical systems on the planet. With much of the Arctic melted, neither the jet stream or the Gulf Stream are behaving in the ways that they're supposed to behave. And the planet's hydrological cycle, the way that water moves around the planet, is utterly and completely out of kilter. And one result, I think, will be, to go back to your introduction, John, that we may at some point actually remember that the economy is a subset of the physical universe and not the other way around. A very hard lesson for people who've spent their whole lives thinking that the cultures that have spent their whole lives thinking that the economy is the central thing. And it's funny, you can even hear it in the language that we use, our tender affection for the state of the economy. The economy is ailing. The economy is in recovery. The economy has taken a turn for the worse. The economy, on and on and on, and yet we've taken the while the economy runs its mild fevers and, so on, the thing upon which it rests is now in very close to, if not a kind of terminal decline. And it's about time to figure that out and get on it.
Yeah, I mean, it's nice that you brought in, our friend Herman Daly's brilliant observation about the economy being a wholly owned subsidiary, and I see my friend Peter Brown here, who actually hired Herman Daly at University of Maryland. So we've got a lot of the great folks who have understood this for a long time and taught me about this as a former banker who learned all about the economy and knew nothing about the ecology. And yet here we are in 2023, and not that much has shifted. And, I guess, before we get into sort of what do we do about it, I mean, is there anything either of you, Gus or Bill, I'm just curious to really push you on a personal level, how you're processing this. I mean, is it just get up in the morning and fight, or, you've each written a memoir. Gus has started writing poetry. What's shifted in your own lives, if I can probe a little bit further?
Well, one thing that's shifted for me, John, is just, what does it mean to me personally to be still in the fight, as I was saying, and you were saying, what if that really is the thing that is a salvation for some of us, and there are a couple of things that come to mind that are different. One is to begin to think and to communicate with people about what happens if we keep losing. And, I think we have to admit that, that's a possibility, that it would be, unfortunately, way too long before we bring the emissions down to zero. And thinking hard about what that means. They're just things that we're not attending to. We're really not attending nearly enough to the preparation and the systems that are going to be needed to cope with this problem. The UN is in kind of nowheresville, I think, when it comes to having a comprehensive a program of preparation and action, starting with the COP process and going right down to how do you help a desperate country that's trying to live with climate change. So we just need to think about the whole system of dealing with this issue at the international level. So that's one of the things that I've tried to turn attention to. And another is what happens when there's no time for system change. I spent decades preaching the idea that dealing with the climate change problem was going to require deep changes in our political economy, deep changes in the system. And I still believe that over time, but we're at the point now where we need to act in a heroic way to deal with this issue. And before all of the changes that we'd like to see in our political economy are brought to fruition. And so it really is it's a question of trying to see how to bring together system change and the immediate actions that are needed for climate change. And so I've fretted a lot about that, tried to write a little bit about it. But it's a challenge that, how do you integrate into our immediate actions on climate the system changing ideas that are needed and teach the system changing lessons that are needed. So those are some of the things that are on my mind.
If I can reflect on your first point, I've sort of given up on this particular soapbox, but just as one example, there's almost no conversation about how we expect fossil fuel nations, think of the Middle East countries that are highly dependent on fossil fuels. There's almost no conversation about how we actually can facilitate them completely transforming their economy away from dependency on fossil fuels. And there's a country that's at war with Ukraine right now, which is at the top of the list. If we expect these countries to actually voluntarily or with compensation leave fossil fuels in the ground, that entails the biggest economic development project since post-World War II. And I don't know, Bill, maybe I'm missing, maybe those conversations are happening, but is there any discussion about what we expect these countries to do with their economies if we somehow force them to leave the $20 trillion of fossil fuels in the ground that we actually need them to leave in the ground?
Well, it's a conversation, but a conversation that, among other things, could begin closer to home.
Including Texas, by the way.
At this point, the biggest exporter of oil and gas in the world is the United States. The four countries that are going to increase their fossil fuel production most over the next 10 years, all of it for export, are the US, Canada, Norway, and Australia. These are all countries that have endless number of other things they could be doing instead. Yeah. They have diversified economies, on and on and on. And instead, they're just, constantly conceding to the most craven and politically powerful forces in the country. So to go back to your question about what one's personally doing, I'm very glad that Gus is doing all he's doing. And I'm far less creative and interesting. I just keep punching away. And our work at the last year or so, 2 years, has been forming this, organizing this new cohort of people, those of us over the age of 60, in this group called Third Act, where we've now got tens of thousands of volunteers and state chapters across the country. And we're taking on precisely these issues, including trying to take on the parts of the American financial system that are most egregiously engaged in all this work. I mean, our four big banks are the four biggest lenders to the fossil fuel industry in the world. You know, BlackRock owns way more oil than anybody else on planet Earth, you know? So we have a lot of stuff we can be doing. And so, you know, everybody tell your grandparents about Third Act, get them to join up so we can keep causing as much trouble as possible. I got to say, I think that there are people working to some degree on these questions of transformation, and it'll be interesting to watch this kind of charade of global negotiation in Abu Dhabi this November, chaired by the head of the UAE oil company.
How does that happen?
Well, how did it happen?
Can help me understand that?
Well, how did it happen that the CEO of Exxon became Secretary of State of the United States?
Right.
You know, a guy who'd got the Order of Friendship from Vladimir Putin for investing so much money in Russian oil. I mean, you know, oligarchy looks the same the world over, you know, so the only conceivable response, the only two conceivable responses to this, and I think they have to go hand in hand, are one, the very, very rapid expansion of renewable energy undercutting markets. And that's not impossible. We now live on a planet where engineers have cut the price of clean energy so sharply that the cheapest way to produce power on our Earth is to point a sheet of glass at the sun. So that's half of it, but by itself, that won't happen fast enough to meet the time that the physicists are telling us we've got. So we also need a big movement to break, if we can, the political power of the fossil fuel industry. And we're building it around the world, and we've had some success, things like these vast divestment movements and things. And they're clearly on their last, last big turn of the wheel. But that big turn of the wheel for the fossil fuel industry, if they're able to maintain their business model another 10 or 15 years, will be enough to break the planet's physical systems.
You know, Bill, one of the consequences of particularly the U.S.'s policy response to, the inflation that we've experienced, raising interest rates, which, this is not a conversation about monetary policy, but, the kind of Newtonian knee-jerk reaction that we've got some inflation, therefore we have to raise interest rates to put the economy to slow the economy. One of the unintended consequences of that has been a significant slowdown in the rollout of renewables. And I've seen that, in the very largest renewable energy developer in the United States just put out a revised forecast on their growth rate. And that's a growth rate we want to be high.
Yep.
And it caused the stock to sell off 15% just on that announcement.
Yep.
And so the cost of capital, as well as the cost of materials, supply chain issues still linked to COVID, has actually materially slowed down what's likely to be that rollout, which is insane because it was sort of a self-inflicted, unnecessary wound for something that's way more important than a little bit of inflation. But we don't think of it that way. We have a central bank that's just focused on one thing, and so consequences be damned.
Yep.
So,
well, when we think of all these terrible things that are still going on, and I know later on we're going to talk more about some of the positive things that are happening.
Yeah, let's do it now, Gus. The reason we played that song is we want to focus on the cracks where the lights getting in. So help shift us.
Oh, well, yeah. Well, there are a lot of positive things going on, and Bill is very good at keeping them in the forefront as well. How it'll all balance out, I don't know. My own belief is that we're going to go through a very hard period with tremendous losses to people and to nature around the world before we achieve a semblance of normalcy. Well, it won't be normalcy. It's the wrong word. Whatever that future is going to look like. But there are some positive things that are happening which we could build on. And one of the biggest things is that the public has just come alive to the issue.
Yeah.
And that's a sea change. And we give Bill a lot of credit for making that happen too. There are a lot of other things going on, including tremendous insults around the world from climate destruction. But even the media is alive to the issue now, believe it or not. And that's a big change. We've seen a rise in activism that's tremendously encouraging, particularly among youth and affected, victimized groups of people all around. And we've seen a different tone and approach from leaders in religion, in science, even some politicians, and even in the courts. Wonderful proceeding yesterday before the European Human Rights Tribunal. Portuguese kids raising the climate issue. And that's one of what has been a huge outpouring of litigation of various types on this issue. And I could go on. Bill mentioned the lowering of the prices of alternatives. And one thing that has to be impressive in a way, is the way that the private, I don't give the private sector any real credit for helping on this problem so far, but they do know how to chase a buck. And when the money's opened up under the Inflation Reduction Act in the U.S., the response has been impressive. And
extraordinary, yeah.
We'll see what happens, but so I'm just kind of going down my little list of things that give me a little comfort at night.
Bill, what I know you're about to gear up on this fossil fuel export, but is there, one of the things I learned about system science is that systems really only change in response to pressure. And whether it's the activist pressure or the actual climate pressure, there's no question the pressure is a lot hotter today than it was even 2 years ago. Are you sensing any shift in the tide in the politics in the United States, despite all the dysfunction around climate issues, or is it still?
There's definitely shifts. Our problem is timing.
Yeah.
Climate change is proceeding at a much faster pace than our political systems normally proceed. So Joe Biden has a terrific climate policy circa 2002 or so. And the IRA and the build out of renewable energy and stuff is admirable, and we should exactly what we should be doing. And God forbid we backslide and return Republicans to any more power than they currently have, because they're transparently unable to use it in the public interest in any way. But the efforts that they're making at the moment don't work on the same timescale that we're working on. So yes, public pressure will be there, but the degree to which that public pressure has to be absolutely constant and unwavering is daunting, because no one's really paid to provide that public pressure. It's the constant work of volunteers like me to gin up that pressure. And the minute you let off for a moment, my friend Greta Thunberg did a fantastic job building up extraordinary pressure by 2019 or so. And it scared financial leaders at places enough to actually think that they might have to make change. And so we saw a series of promises from the BlackRocks and even a couple of the European oil companies and the banks, and they started prattling on about net zero and things. But then came the, pandemic and the inability to keep that pressure up in the streets and things. And they instantly backslid. BP is back to, we're going to do oil and gas. That's our main thing. Larry Fink immediately, stopped talking about climate change and, back to business as usual.
And he put the head of Saudi Aramco on his board.
Yes, the cravenness of the people who are the leaders of our establishments is remarkable to me sometimes. The plural of privilege is establishment, I think. And if you have the perks and benefits that go with being a part of that establishment, and yet you're unwilling to shoulder even the slightest of the responsibilities that might go with it, then you're not a very worthwhile human being. And I think we're discovering the essential character of the people at the top of our financial systems and things. So the pressure will continue to come from movements, but increasingly the pressure will also come from events in the real world. If I were an economist watching this, I would keep my eye, among other things, on what's happening with insurance and our ability to deal with and hedge risk going forward. The insurance industry may be the most craven of all, since you have had the actuarial data for decades, and some parts of all these companies have written worthwhile reports and things about what we need to be doing. But they've never stopped investing in the fossil fuel industry. They've never even stopped being willing to write policies for the new pipelines and things that, and as a result, they're beginning to surrender one of the most important pieces of technology human beings ever developed. I mean, the actuarial table is at the heart of really how we wouldn't do anything in this world if we couldn't hedge risk to one degree or another. And it's an incredible human invention, the actuarial table. The only problem is it basically depends on the world behaving in the future as it's behaving.
The future being like the past. Yeah.
And if that's no longer the case, then, and we're beginning to see this, I mean, unable to write even, simple things like homeowners policies for large parts of the country.
For 1 year. Yeah.
The friction and the drag that's going to place on our economy is going to be tremendous, and it's different than the kind of ups and downs of interest rates and things. That's a one-way ratchet, I think.
Yeah.
John, I have really a question for you and Bill. If I'm, tell me whether you're seeing this happening or I'm just imagining it. What I think is beginning to happen is that this one consequence that we haven't talked about yet, the situation is so bad and the risks are so great that it's leading a lot of people to dream really about a new system, to think about deeper changes that are needed. And I think, some of it is just escapism, but a lot of it is really well grounded in what's realistically possible and good science and good economics. So we may be, on the verge of seeing enough people really change their consciousness that it becomes a force that could be enormously important in the future. People are the system is being delegitimized. People are looking for a new system. They're looking for ways to think and believe and to imagine a future that's different from what we have now. maybe this is just my fantasy. What do you think?
Well, I mean, that's as you know, Gus, sort of I'm one of the dreamers, I suppose. But I've moved to kind of an acceptance that, you know, we're in it and it's too late to stop a lot of pain and damage. And a lot of things are going to need to shift and go away. And you know, what I hold on to personally is that no matter what happens, and I don't think any of us know what's going to happen. And I'm super thankful for the efforts that the Bill McKibbens of the world are putting to you know, raise the pressure. But I do feel that, you know, we're going into a whole new reality, and no matter what happens, I'm just personally convinced that we're going to need to learn to live more in alignment with how life works, and that this experiment of extractive economic growth has run its course. And so if we were to shift our system tomorrow to a regenerative economy, or 100 years from tomorrow, it's still where we're going to have to go. It's just a question of how much damage will happen in the meantime. And so, you know, I'm sure in fact, I use you know, a little icon of you know, the man on the horse, I'm having a mental block, anyway, it doesn't matter. But I'm sure I'm accused of being a dreamer, but
Don Quixote.
Don Quixote, thank you, whoever said that. But I think this shifting consciousness is where we're being forced to head, and the good news is that it's happening. But as Bill said earlier, it's obviously happening slower than it needs to, and that's the angst I go to bed with on a daily basis. But Bill, you wrote a book about the economy, gosh, well over 10 years ago. What's your take on that? And then we'll bring in our community into this conversation. But
well, that book, Deep Economy, was really about where I think eventually we may end up if we're lucky, which is with the more localized economies that are less fixated on growth and more on the kind of stability and security that this century requires. You know, our for the last century, the only question we've asked about anything is, does this make the economy grow faster or not? And if the answer is yes, then we do it, you know. And so we've built an economy that's like a racehorse, you know, it goes very fast under ideal conditions. But the minute the track turns muddy or there's a pothole or something, it snaps a leg with great ease. And I think we need a sort of draft horse economy. And I think actually there are ways that we will get there over time. Truthfully, I think that the transition to solar and wind power is more than just the transition to low carbon energy that'll do less climate damage. It's also, if you think about it, the transition to an economy that relies on things that are available almost anywhere, as opposed to one that relies on the few deposits of fossil fuel scattered around the planet, and hence empowers the people who have control over those. Vladimir Putin, the Koch brothers, the king of Saudi Arabia, whoever the hell it is. And so I think that actually could be an extraordinarily important step down this path. If we were smart, we'd go down that path with as much community involvement as possible for lots of reasons. The resentment over solar farms and wind towers and stuff is far less in places like Denmark, where they've done a much better job of extending ownership of those assets to the communities in which they're placed. And but one way or another, I think that'll happen over time, to one degree or another. And so I think that's for me, that's a kind of North Star to hold on to. The more assets we can get out of control of huge corporate and governmental entities, the better we're going to be over the long run.
And one other, sliver of light, which I think has a huge potential from what I've learned, and it's aligned with your distributed free energy bill, is this really quite recent developments in what's called ultra deep geothermal. And interestingly, one of the leading companies in this is founded by a former oil and gas exploration engineer. So the answer has been literally right under our feet, and the oil companies have been, too ignorant, too stubborn, whatever, to search for it. But we're, the technology, as I understand it, isn't there yet, but it's quite promising that we'll be able to tap, the immense heat underneath everyone's feet in almost an unlimited way if we can figure out how to drill deep enough in an efficient way. So.
That'd be nice. But the good news for the next 10 years is we have off the shelf cheap solar power and cheap wind power and ever cheaper batteries to store the power. And in the sort of crucial period that's going to tell the tale in terms of cutting carbon emissions or not, that's our main ally. The sun, the good Lord was kind enough to hang a large ball of burning gas 93 million miles away. And we now have the wit to make full use of it, catch its rays directly on photovoltaic panels, take advantage of the fact that it differentially heats the earth, creating the winds that move those turbines. Energy from heaven, man. Go for
it.
Let me open it up to the group here. I'm sure there'll be lots of.
John, I want to just finish the thought I had earlier just with one quick comment. I know you want to move on. I would like to challenge folks to think about the proposition that the crisis is forcing more and more people to see the systemic roots of the crisis, and people are digging deeper. You see that particularly, for example, in the attack on consumerism and the need to change the consumerist behavior as much as we can, and you see it in another of the root causes of the problem, and that's our corporatocracy, and more people are seeing these connections, so I think there could be something very profound that we don't normally think of coming out of this crisis, and that is a set of new realizations about what the real problems are, which could lead to some very far-reaching solutions for where we ought to go.
Well said. I agree.